A lot has changed in the last 4 years in Mexico. So when Canada, the United States, and Mexico get together to talk about migration issues, he was a special kind of hateful incompetence. But one of his many characteristics is he hates Central Americans. And so it's about 8 man-hours all in just to produce this stuff before you start shipping and smuggling it and make $1 million. A lot has changed in the last 4 years in Mexico. Let's start with the first thing. Mexico's now a net destination country for migration. So when Canada, the United States, and Mexico get together to talk about migration issues, the tone and the substance of those talks has changed quite a bit, because Mexico is now not just a transit state, it's also a destination state. And the Mexican government, until recently, was led by AMLO, who he was a special kind of hateful incompetence. But one of his many characteristics is he hates Central Americans. And so there were a number of periods, both under Trump and under Biden, where you were seeing some pretty harsh policies in Mexico towards people who were trying to pass through. And so there was this weird little tug of war in AMLO's mind. I don't like Americans. I don't like Central Americans. Who do I want to work against today? So if relations with the United States were okay, he'd pick up the Central Americans, drop them back on the southern side of his southern border. And if relations with the Americans were not going well, he'd encourage them to pass through. And so it's been this weird mix. That's on the government side. On the drug side, it's gotten really bad. Okay, so we're used to cocaine, right? I mean, I'm not saying you do cocaine. I'm not saying anyone should do cocaine.
Retract that statement.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Yeah. It's like, but the production cycle and the transport cycle, we know, you start in Bolivia or Colombia, you grow the stuff, you process it, you get the white powder, you ship that to Central America, it follows on land up through Mexico, all the mountain passes, eventually getting to the U.S. border. It's a long, convoluted supply chain that involves thousands of people for each couple of kilos that are involved. And so it's about 8 man-hours all in just to produce this stuff before you start shipping and smuggling it. Well, about 3 years ago, organized crime groups in Mexico really discovered fentanyl. And fentanyl doesn't require any acreage, doesn't require any growing or drying. There's a lab process, but that can be done by 3 Kramer quality lab techs in like 6 days to get a kilo of stuff. And so instead of having a handful of largish players in South America producing this stuff, you now have thousands of small mom and pop operations operating out of a garage across Mexico. And instead of having 2 or 3 really big cartel or cartel alliances, we now have hundreds of local organized crime groups. And all of them just want to shift the stuff north because the money is so much better than it is for cocaine. So instead of having a truck that might have, 50 kilos in the trunk of cocaine, you now have people who can just walk across the border with 2 kilos and make $1 million. And it's a very different sort of geography of smuggling. And by having the asylum-style border opening, we don't have any of the pieces in place to really fight it.
Yeah, it's funny. A couple people we've had on the show talked about how they're not using body carriers to cross it. Look at the numbers. And my argument to them was like, well, the numbers are only the numbers that we catch. You know what I mean? On the borders, there's definitely drugs coming across the border. We're definitely missing a lot somewhere. And fentanyl is killing.
Well, I mean, it's a scale issue. So if you take every bit of the fentanyl that Border Patrol has intercepted in the last 3 years, the precursor materials that it takes to build all of that, it's only 33 55-gallon drums. That's it. That's all it takes. And most of these fab facilities that are garage labs, they're only making 1 kilo a week or 1 kilo a month. You don't need much of a transport network to get this stuff across because the concentration is so tiny.
That's great. And Mexico just chooses not to combat against it, or is
Yes
it
and
so
no.
cool?
So firstly, yes, AMLO, like I said, is an asshat, and he decided not to basically enforce law enforcement anywhere in the country for his entire term. And so we saw a breakdown of the police forces all across the system. But that started well before the switch from cocaine to fentanyl.
Yeah.
And now with fentanyl, you've got hundreds of groups who are suddenly multimillionaires because of illicit activity. And the ability of these mom and pop operations to bribe on a scale that is so much bigger than the cartels could do. Uh, I mean, fighting it is a law enforcement issue, and AMLO absolutely did the country a discredit. But I'm not sure how you fight something that is that easy to produce and move, especially when it generates that sort of income. I mean, we need to come up with a completely new model for law enforcement to grapple with this. And since the stuff has only been in existence for a couple of years, we're very early in that process.
You say law enforcement. You're saying Mexican law enforcement, correct? Does that
At
spill
the
over into us?
moment, Mexican law enforcement, because
Right.
this is where the stuff is being fabricated. But because it's so easy to make, let's say that Mexico succeeds in completely somehow purging fentanyl labs from their entire country. Well, then they'll be in Oklahoma.
Yeah, just
And
like
so we're going to have to figure
methamphetamines
this
was.
out too.
Right. How about the newly elected president? I know you made a recent video about her, Claudia Scheinbaum. Do you see there be any kind of impacts from her?
She's definitely not as anti-American. She's definitely not as racist. She can definitely do better math. She's definitely had a real job before becoming president, like AMLO, who was just a professional opposition activist. She was Mexico City's mayor and did a pretty solid job from the point of view of most of the people who live there, and that's what really matters. So if you're looking for someone who's a little bit more of a technocrat, who can make the trains run on time, who understands that law enforcement is a thing that needs to be done, everything seems to be moving in the right direction. The problem, of course, is that she considers herself to be AMLO's protege. And so how much power will AMLO have over her moving forward? And his last big reform, as he calls it, was to change the law so that Supreme Court justices would basically be appointed by his party stalwarts, which, bad. And one of the first things she did when coming into the job is saying, yeah, and the Supreme Court can't rule on that. The Supreme Court has no jurisdiction over legal issues. I'm like, pretty sure that's not what the Supreme Court's there for. So I have my hopes, I have my concerns, but she's only been there for 3 days. I'll give her a little bit more time.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to watch. When I've had a lot of people talk about it and they're not sure what to expect. I'm just hoping that there's some kind of positive out of that, and that hopefully whoever is elected our president can build that relationship so we can hopefully come to some kind of answer to slowing down the traffic down the border. And also,
now, I have not been shy about my criticism of Donald Trump on almost everything. I'm not a liberal. I'm something far worse. I'm an informed moderate. But Trump had a fantastic working relationship with AMLO for all of Trump's faults. And so NAFTA 2 was renegotiated under their joint tenure. That was a huge success for both countries. And what progress we made on immigration reform, wrong word, immigration enforcement, was because the two of them could see eye to eye in a lot of things.